How to start compost heap from scratch, and it's covering some of the stuff we've already talked about, but this is just from scratch. So this is my 5 or 6 or 7, I'm not sure yet. Easy steps to make compost. And so you've already chosen your compost bay. You might have the wooden pallets, you might have plastic Dalek or compost bin. You might have some netting, or you might get some straw bales, 4 straw bales, put them in a square. That a lot of my early compost heaps were just with straw bales on their sides. So you've got how you're going to make compost. So that's number 1. What kind of unit are you going to use? Okay, number 2 is literally, and every time you get some nitrogen-rich ingredients, you're going to put the same amount of carbon-rich ingredients into your unit. You're going to have the garden fork, which is number 3, garden fork, and mix it up. You're going to have the watering can and water. And then you're going to repeat. So let's go through an example. An example would be, I've got 3 or 4 days of food scraps. I chuck my food scraps in. On the side, I've got some straw, some shredded cardboard, some wood chips, some sawdust, any of those ingredients ready to go, and I put a similar amount of carbon-rich ingredients into the compost at the same time. I get my garden fork, mix the 2 together, or mix it into the growing heap, and a little sprinkle of water, and then that's number 4, add the water, and then 5, I'm going to put a cover on it, and the cover is to keep the birds out, it's to keep rain events out when we get those 3 or 4 days of rain in a row. It's also to keep the moisture from evaporating. Old plastic covers are really good, old black building plastic or something like that. I know it's plastic, but you could use old cardboard as well, but it's just a great way. The moisture, hits that cover and goes back down, and it's just amazing how it increases the composting ability. And that's it. Oh, well, and number 6, when we're out of lockdown, grab a handful of worms or grab a kilo of worms and chuck them in there as well, because the worms really are, if they're not there already in your system, if you see some, there's no need to buy any. They breed at such a rapid rate. You're creating this lovely space for them. Sorry about that blurry photo, but you're creating this lovely space for them to eat food and be a home for them. So they'll come en masse if there's a few of them around. And it's amazing how quickly they'll multiply and how quickly they will arrive. It's worth giving it a few weeks just to see if they are around in your garden space already. And that's as easy as that. So on this one, we can expand it out. We've got the PDF, the handouts, where you can go into a bit more detail. But in its essence, it's literally those 6 points. And it's if I come back to point number 2, which is adding that nitrogen. So say we mow the lawn, rather than chucking all the lawn clippings, and we've all done it, into the compost bay, have a carbon source on the side and chuck some, do some layers, or do a layer of grass clippings and then a layer of your carbon source, and then maybe fork those 2 together with the garden fork, mix them together, and then you could do another layer of grass clippings and another layer of that, or say wood chips, say we had, and mix those together, watering as we go along. And so instead of having this giant compost full of grass clippings, suddenly you're making this amazing compost heap with the carbon and nitrogen and water. And you should, if you've got a huge lawn, you'll get a heat spike out of that. Generally, we're cold composting here, and the difference between the 2 is, you see the compost bay there. To make a hot compost, we are filling it all up to the top today in one go. We've collected all our ingredients. We've got lots of ingredients, and we mix those carbon and rich and nitrogen-rich ingredients, and we put it into the compost bay and add the water, boom. But what most people are doing is just slowly adding a bit today, bit tomorrow, mow the lawn on the weekend, gradually building it up. And so that's why adding the worms is fantastic. Having the cover on top is fantastic. And that constant mixing that carbon. And generally, if you look at what you're putting in your compost, it's generally just the food scraps and just grass clippings. And as a rule, that's what most people are putting in there. And then now and again, they might chuck a whole load of leaves or a whole, it's all, so say you've got a lot of leaves, that's when you might store them to the side. And every time you put the food scraps in, big handful of those leaves, chuck those in with them, mix it in. And what can happen is magic can happen before your eyes. You can actually start seeing compost being made before, as you start rising up, you can actually start seeing the compost down lower in the lower levels as you're coming up. It's incredible. It's really amazing. It's quite magical. And on that, we can go to some more questions.
Okay, one from Joanne. She says she's got a lot of the wool linings from my food bag, and would they be okay on top of a compost bin?
Fantastic. So there's a carbon source. There's some nutrients in there as well. Just again, so the more you break anything up, the easier it can break down. So you could put a sheet of cardboard into your compost heap. It will break down over time, but it's going to take a long time to break down compared to if you shredded that cardboard up. So it's the same with the wool blankets, is to pull them apart a bit, mix them in with the food scraps. Fantastic source, fantastic in there. And you could also try using them around your lettuces as well. I haven't tried it with these. It might be just interesting to see if it's a slug deterrent or not. They talk about woolly dags, sheep dags being a bit of deterrent. So it'd be interesting to see if that is a deterrent to slugs or not in this situation. But yeah, so again, put it in, break it up. Smaller anything is in your compost heap, the quicker it will break down.
It's almost like eating food. The more you chew it in your mouth, the less your stomach has to work.
Yes, indeed.
Another question from Lawrence, who says, I've got a 3-bay. How often should I turn it from bay to bay?
Generally, you're going to turn it once it gets to the top. If you've been using that garden fork all the way up, as you've been making that heap, there's less need to turn into the next bay. You could just leave it and just keep an eye on moisture levels, got the worms in there, and allow it to break down. If you want to speed up your composting process, you can turn it into the next bay. And one of the great things about turning a compost heap into the side bay is you get to see are parts dry, are parts not breaking down. Is there a corner that seems very carbon rich and very little nitrogen? And so when you do turn, you can put generally the outside becomes the goal is for the outside edges to become the inside, and vice versa. So it's how enthusiastic are you? You could do it every day and you'd make compost very fast. But generally, as a rule, I turn my compost heap once. But if you're in a rush or you lack of space and you want to make it faster, you could go anything from daily, weekly, monthly. But the more you do it, the quicker it will break down and you get to see those moisture levels. I'll quickly talk about moisture because it's kind of another key with this turning. When you put your hand into the compost, you're going to put your hand in, you're going to grab a handful and you're going to squeeze really tightly. And what you want to see is 1 or 2 drops dropping out, and you want to see some moisture in your knuckles. And that's a 50% moisture level, and that's what we're after. We're after 50%. If it's less than that, you need to up the moisture levels. If it's more than that, you need to open up the compost heap and allow some of that moisture to escape. because we're wanting 50%, because we need the oxygen as well in there. We need the oxygen and the water.
And this question sort of carries on from that, but you might be answering it in more detail later. But Hannah has asked, how do you know when your compost soil is ready?
I'll answer it now. Why not? In case I forget. As a rule, you know your compost is ready because none of the ingredients, you can't recognize anything you put in. So it doesn't mean it's this fine, tilthy soil. It's not like a kind of, lots of tiny particles. It can still be quite lumpy because you might have put some wood chips and twigs and a lot of those are still being there, but they're in this decomposing form. But they're also don't be alarmed at them. They're fantastic. They're still food, and they're food for the bacteria and the fungi. To feed off, and so they're a fantastic part. If you need, you're making a potting mix or something, you could sieve them out and then put them around a fruit tree or those bigger pieces somewhere else in the garden, happily. But that generally it's if we can't see what the ingredients look like anymore. Now and again, you might still have the odd bit of straw that still looks like a bit of straw, but as a general rule, you can't see. And there might be the odd lemon or the odd corn husk that hasn't quite fully decomposed.
Cool. Another one about worms from Peta says, I live at over 700 meters and my one worm farm died over a very cold winter. Do I need to ensure worms are alive and replace perhaps in the spring? It's pretty cold up here.
Yes. Worms, as a rule, they like it at, their perfect temperature is around 25 degrees Celsius. And that's a bit hard when our average temperatures are nowhere near that. So in your situation, and generally most of our situations in the South Island, generally around New Zealand, unless you're in a warmer spot, we're all having colder winters. Particularly down south here, we have very hard winters. Worm farms really need to be brought inside, and that doesn't mean being put in your cold garage. It might mean, well, no one's going to be bringing their worm farm inside. I'd like you all to. I'd like you to bring them and pop them in the laundry or in your hot water cupboard, and they'll love you for it. So the other option then is on a north-facing wall. Or under the eaves on a north-facing, or somewhere where they're going to get more sun. And then you might decide to put a blanket, depending on what kind of worm farm you have, put a blanket over it, a couple of straw bales, but you might put a bit of polystyrene. Oh, polystyrene's not great. Maybe a woolly fadge or something, a bit of wool or something inside the roof, just to try and keep temperatures. You could even go as far as wrapping it with a bit of black builder's paper if you had some, like you knew someone who had some, as another way of just trying to insulate the worm farm. I don't go into it today, but take a look at in-ground worm farms. That's a way of, the ground temperatures generally aren't changing all year round, and so we can create an in-ground worm farm using something like a bin like this dug into the ground, and our soil level can be here, and we can have a series of them in a veggie garden, in a berm, and they can really work very well as a substitute as another worm farm and another way to deal with food scraps. Very simple system. Even at your 700 meters, I'm at around 400 meters here. Ground temperatures aren't changing too much. Over winter, you might put a bit more insulation on the top, and same. Yeah. So spring. So coming back to one part of your question about spring, now would be, unless you're going to really love them and look after them with some heat, now would be a tough time to start a worm farm from scratch, if you like. But if you're enthusiastic, you're keen, you've got a nice warm spot that might help. They might like. Then
There's just a follow up or maybe a clarification on that. About saying just the worms in the compost outside. So presumably she's got a big compost already and the worms in there. Is
So
there a way of
generally,
keeping them alive?
generally in compost, you know, they're fine. That you've got such a body of mass of, you know, of material there that they cope all winter long, and they'll cope even with those, you know, -5s, -10s in that mass. If they've got a smaller mass, i.e., say a worm farm, then they can freeze and they can, you know, one year I had a bath that, you know, ideally I should have insulated the sides, worm farm, and we had some -13s, -14s, which we haven't had for a long time, thankfully, but we, you know, they do appear now and again, and that really knocked them back. But whether that, if they'd been in the compost heap, they would have had a better chance of survival in there. Would have, yeah, they would gone, yeah. So you should, so yes, you should be fine in your compost heap.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
And this was another question from Lawrence. Is it better to cover his compost heap during winter if it's presumably not covered at the moment?
Yeah, I would cover it. Yeah, I think it's fantastic. Really aids decomposition. It stops, if we have a wet winter, you're not going to lose nutrients being leached out as it, you know, when it rains. If we have some rain events, you can lose a lot of nutrients just flushing through. And then also what can happen is your compost heap can go anaerobic. You know, it becomes too wet, and then it becomes smelly. And if it's bad smells, you're making bad compost. You've got bad bacteria. You know, bad. You know, it's bad. So hence a cover is really useful as being able to modify. You know, keep an eye on moisture levels and keep the kind of moisture levels that you want easily, and then you get any evaporation gets captured as well. If we're going for, you know, we are dry generally, so if it's dry, you don't lose as much moisture.
I'll just do one more before we move on. How frequently do you recommend aerating the compost using a garden fork?
Every time you go to it. If you, I mean, it depends how much we talk, but if we're just talking the top layer, every time you add something is a great opportunity to add that carbon and mix it in with that layer that's already there. Otherwise, you don't have to get down deep, and if you've got lots of carbon in there, it's creating spaces for oxygen. What if you decide to turn the heap, then you're creating that mix happily. But generally with that garden fork, just, you know, that top layer, as you're rising, as the compost rises with your layers, you can be as enthusiastic as you like with that, and you'll start seeing things breaking down. Because what happens is, you know, it's like a party. The carbon and nitrogen ingredients come together, the bacteria is in there, and other microbodies doing their stuff, and you're kind of mixing up the party a bit so other people can party together. So that can be really beneficial. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Ben.
Awesome. Okay, so I've got one question actually, which I should pop it in now, which you mentioned earlier to me, and it seems relevant right now. It's the fruit flies question.
Yes.
So sometimes you get a compost heap with heaps of fruit flies. So here's some solutions to the fruit flies. 1, put a cover on it. 2, get your garden fork out and weather the storm of fruit flies in your face. Maybe put some sunnies on, and get that garden fork and really turn over that top layer. And what you're doing is you're disrupting the life cycle of the bug. So you're almost inverting layers. But every time you go out, be really vigorous in doing that. And so you'll disrupt that lifespan. And then make sure, often the sign of got lots of fruit flies is you've not got enough carbon-rich ingredients in your compost heap. So generally, you've just got food scraps, lawn clippings. So make sure you really up your carbon, which we mentioned earlier, your straw, wood chips, cardboard, all those leaves, all those things. Really, you know, we're looking for a minimum 50-50 of nitrogen-rich to carbon-rich ingredients. So, and then you could also sprinkle a bit of garden lime in there as well, and that can really help too.